In honor of doing a movie review in this video, I decided to wear cinema red just for this video. Is cinema red a thing? I just feel like this reminds me of going to a movie. Is it like the AMC color of employees? Like, what am I thinking of? Or like old school movie theaters, employees wear red? Anyway, I watched the new Whitney Houston movie, the new biopic, so that you don't have to. So since Whitney Houston's death about a decade ago, I remember hearing that she had died. I was an RA in college, so this was like 2012, I believe. So over a decade ago, I remember that moment. And now that it's been over a decade, of course, there's been several documentaries about her life and death. There's been books written, and this is the latest film about her life. My first thought when I found out there was a new movie, I was like, do we really need another one? I mean, I feel like there was a biopic about her life not that long ago. There was a Lifetime movie with the girl from America's Next Top Model. There's been so many movies. There's been so many documentaries. So I was like, do we really need another one? But I was home on a Friday night. I had ordered Papa John's pizza, and I was like, Netflix is recommending this. If Netflix is behind it, it better be good. And I went ahead and watched this movie that, by the way, runs over 2 hours long. And I was unsatisfied with this movie. By the way, as far as I know, this is the first movie since her death about Whitney Houston's life that was backed by a huge studio. It was backed by Sony Entertainment, huge company, right? Corporation. Also had a partnership with Netflix. So it was backed by money, is what I'm trying to say, versus, let's say, the Lifetime movie. You know, Lifetime movies get made fun of. Like, they're not taken seriously as cinematic works.
You're my third best friend in the whole world. Third? Who are the first two? Ben and Jerry. Lifetime. Television for idiots. Peter?
Lifetime movies are known to be very dramatic, like over-dramatic, overacted, melodramatic. That's the word, melodramatic. And so there was a Whitney Houston movie that was on Lifetime, and it was all those things. I have to tell you, that's how I felt watching this movie, which is not actually a Lifetime movie, but ironically, I felt like I was watching a Lifetime movie. At the same time, I'm like, Whitney Houston's life was dramatic. I mean, she, at one point, was the biggest singer in the world. And the word singer, I don't mean just pop star, I mean singer, vocalist. Like, she was recognized for her talent. She was on top of the charts, on top of the world. She was in movies. Like, she was kind of like Michael Jackson at a certain point. She was kind of everywhere, right? You turn on the radio, she's there. You walk into a supermarket, you hear Whitney Houston. You turn on the TV, you see The Bodyguard. Like, there was a moment in time when Whitney Houston was ruling as a singer. And then obviously her fall from grace, substance abuse issues. That's a very dramatic story, to be the biggest singer in the world and then to die prematurely, partially because of drug usage. They found cocaine in her body when she drowned in a bathtub at a hotel. I mean, she does have a dramatic life story. So on the one hand, I was like, it is a tragic, dramatic tale, but on the other hand, I wasn't completely connected to the movie. You know how sometimes a movie moves you because it's so well thought out and orchestrated, and other times it's almost like a Lifetime movie, almost comedic in how much the melodrama is turned on, the volume of the melodrama. The other thing is, the actress who played her was very theatrical and dramatic in her performance, and she physically looked like Deborah Wilson a bit. If you guys aren't familiar, Deborah Wilson is a comedian who used to play Whitney Houston all the time in these Mad TV skits, this show called Mad TV, which is a lot like Saturday Night Live. So I don't know if I was kind of projecting that because she reminded me of Deborah Wilson in terms of some of her mannerisms in portraying Whitney Houston, but sometimes I couldn't help but feel disconnected from the movie. At the same time, if you watch Whitney Houston interviews, or especially moments on like a red carpet or at an awards show, particularly when she was with Bobby Brown, you see her kind of being theatrical and acting up because she was high as a kite. So again, on the one hand, I'm like, I guess it was accurate. On the other hand, I couldn't fully connect. But more importantly, I felt that the movie didn't add anything new to the story. Like everything that the movie went through, I felt like I'd already seen it in previous films, whether previous biopics about her or documentaries about her. I've read enough excerpts, I've seen enough films where I feel like I understand the Whitney Houston story. I understand the demise because she felt so much pressure to fit into a box that she didn't really fit into neatly, both when it comes to race, when it comes to sexuality and gender. And the movie does showcase that she came from this super controlling family. She was exploited by her family. Her family is trash. Her dad sued her at one point. So I have compassion for her story and understand the layers. And I also think she's a recipient of the legacy of generational trauma, right? Even just the fact that everything revolves around her singing, like the business, the family business, Arista Records making all this money off of her. She is the cash cow, but she's a woman who beyond this doesn't have any skills. Like she's not particularly educated. She never had to be, right? Because music was kind of destined for her from youth. Like she's gonna carry this torch of the family business of being a singer, related to Dionne Warwick. Her mother was a backup singer for Aretha Franklin. So I did see the movie from a different lens than I had previously, which is the lens of misogyny and, women sometimes kind of inherit a role. And actually it doesn't even have to be about gender. I mean, I look at Michael Jackson and it's a similar story, sort of coming into a life that's already been predetermined for you by your family. And this is what you're gonna do. And then they're kind of trapped in that role because they don't have an education beyond that. They don't have professional or life skills beyond that one thing. And then it kind of becomes like the Britney Spears story where they're almost stuck in a childlike state of not knowing how to handle money, how to handle fame, like how to handle all these things, because they've been purposefully kept in almost this frozen childlike state so that they continue to do what is making everybody else money, because all these other people are dependent on that quality, right? And if somebody is too independent, right, then eventually they might break free, and that's a very scary thing when all these people want to make sure they control the cash cow forever. So it is a tragic story, it is a sad story, there are many layers, but I have to also admit this thing that I felt watching the movie, which I felt previously watching clips of Whitney Houston, particularly interviews, and I feel like if any of her hardcore fans are watching, I might get a beating for this. But it reminded me of what I've been hearing some people say about reality TV over the past few years. Bethany Frankel has spoken about this on her podcast. Andy Cohen has spoken about this. I'm thinking specifically in the framework of reality TV, specifically the shows like The Real Housewives. There is this idea that when someone is too unlikable, they lose their audience. Meaning, with The Real Housewives, for example, there are characters that you kind of love to hate because they're just so ridiculous and entertaining. But once somebody just becomes unlikable to the general public, it can be the end of a career. And I was watching this movie feeling like, I don't like Whitney Houston as a person. As a singer, as a recording artist, her success can never be taken away from her. Like her monumental success, her Olympic colossal talent, you can never take that away from her. But as a person, the way she treated people, the way she handled her life, and of course I'm aware drugs play a huge role in this, but she never seemed likable to me. Like in interviews, for example, she always seemed very defensive and also just a lack of accountability. And there's a scene in the movie where Clive Davis, who basically was at the helm of her career, there's a scene where he says, "Are you tired? Like, do you need a break?" And she, in the scene, is like over it and coked out, and she's like, "Clive, I'm a black woman, of course I'm tired." And I guess that was the movie. They were trying to like have a moment of comic relief. And it is well known that Whitney Houston would make these little like dramatic statements that were meant to be funny and were sometimes kind of cutting. And but it annoyed me hearing that, because to me that sums up Whitney Houston in a nutshell. Just that she never seemed to appreciate what she had and what her life was, and it was always kind of like, I'm a victim. There are people who would kill to have the opportunities that Whitney Houston had. Incredible voice, beautiful woman. In her prime, she was not just in her vocal prime, but just physically, she was poised. She had an elegance. She had the world at her fingertips, you know? And I look at that and I look at how much was given to her. I understand a lot was also taken from her. I understand there's sacrifices with that, and I understand that she wanted a normal life. But my whole thing is like, you can't have all of that. In the movie, they showcase that she kind of was sick of fame. She hated dealing with fans, and that's a well-documented thing, that like she wanted people to leave her alone. She didn't want to give autographs all the time. But then you can't have everything else. Then you can't also have these huge houses and not have to sit behind a desk 9 to 5. Like, sorry, the real world is a tough fucking place. And that kind of entitlement and lack of humility and lack of gratitude it came out in the movie. And that's what I think of when I think of Whitney Houston, that she kind of self-sabotaged what she had built. And the sad part is, if she really did hate everything about the business and the fame and all that, if she had been smart with her money and her choices, she could have retired after, let's say, The Bodyguard, or even just after the 90s, right? After those albums. If she had been strategic and business-minded about everything, she could have done the Cher thing, right? Of like living, you know, on a fucking compound in the middle of nowhere, living her life with her family, or at least the family that she liked, you know, her daughter and Bobby Brown when it wasn't awful. But obviously drugs, right? Drugs are expensive. Drugs completely mess with your mind and how you process things. So I'm aware that that's an element of this that makes this conversation not even relevant, because when drugs are introduced into the situation, into a context, regular logic and reasoning go out the window. But it was frustrating to me, is my point, to watch the movie, and they did sort of show that she was constantly kind of miserable and feeling emotionally tired. Like, you can tell that she lacked energy at a certain point, but it wasn't necessarily physical energy. It was more like she was a broken person. And of course, that was partially because of the exploitation of those around her, like her father and her mother and all that. But the older I get, the more I realize accountability is such an important part of life. Being responsible for your own actions and why you are where you are in life is essential to grow as a person and to thrive as a person. And it's just so crazy to me that somebody can have such incredible talent. I was watching a video yesterday after the movie, and somebody commented on the video of her performance saying like, what a phenomenon of an artist. And I thought that was such a great noun to describe Whitney Houston in her prime as a singer. A phenomenon. She was a phenomenon. Like the way that Michael Jackson was a phenomenon, the way that Elvis was a phenomenon. You don't really get to see that kind of phenomenon nowadays, really at all, I don't think. So it's just so gnarly to me to think that somebody could be that epic as a person, as a talent. You know, it's kind of like a Michael Jordan or an Olympian, right? But the music version, that she was like a titan of music. And I don't understand how you could be there and then end up where she ended up. But I guess that's why it's important to talk about drugs and alcohol, to talk about how if you're broken as a person, everything around you is going to break too. So I say all of that to say her personal life, seeing that captured on screen in the movie, made it even harder, I guess, for me to enjoy the movie, because I was just frustrated by the evolution of her life story as a viewer. But all in all, I don't recommend this movie. You don't need to see it. There's many other sources that you could go to learn about Whitney Houston's life story that are probably less biased, right? You have to remember, a movie like this, when it's backed by a huge corporation, when it's partially backed by her estate, meaning her relatives. You see at the beginning of the movie that Primary Wave Music also is kind of like sponsoring the movie. That is her music publishing. So there's commercial interest in all this, right? People are trying to still make money off of her life and her story and her music. Of course, anytime there's a movie like this, her sales are gonna temporarily kind of rise back up. So you have to think about that, the intention behind a movie like this. I think if you're curious about her life story, I'd recommend instead a documentary that maybe has less bias. Also, I think when somebody is this big and their story is that sort of famous, it just becomes harder to see somebody else play them and to see this fictitious account. Same thing if there was a movie about Michael Jackson, I think it would be difficult to imagine somebody playing him. And to a certain extent, it would feel like a caricature. That's sometimes how I felt watching this movie, that it felt like a caricature of Whitney Houston. So again, if you have that same sort of cynical mindset as me, I guess, and you want to be more sort of engrossed in a movie and in her story, I would recommend a documentary instead, or reading a book, again, that maybe is less biased, meaning not a book written by a former lover of hers or former friend or relative, or her mother had written a book about her. I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend instead a biography or a documentary about her life. Curious what you guys think about Whitney Houston, about her life story, about this movie if you've seen it, or about any of the other works that have been created since her death. In general, I don't feel great about how after somebody's death, somebody as famous and iconic as a Whitney Houston, as an Elvis, as a Michael Jackson, Marilyn Monroe, and so on, I don't like how everybody tries to make a movie, right? Or a show, or write a book suddenly. It feels inherently exploitative. And again, if you're not adding anything new, then what's the point? I do have to finish this video by saying that I do respect Robin Crawford, and the fact that she wrote a book. Robin Crawford was her childhood friend. They did have apparently some kind of love affair that was intertwined with their friendship. It's easy to say, oh, there we go, another person who wrote a book about, Whitney Houston, who knew her. But what I really respect about Robin Crawford is that for the most part, she has kept completely quiet. Once the Bobby Brown marriage really took off, she started distancing herself from the whole family, from not just Whitney Houston, but the whole business, the whole clan. And she wrote the book really to be like, this is my truth. Everybody else is now suddenly talking about this affair that I had with her. I want you guys to know about the purity of the connection that I had with this woman who was my best friend and who I admired both as a friend and as a fan. And I haven't read her book, but I've read excerpts, and you can tell that she really did have a love for her, whereas everybody else who has claimed to have a love for Whitney Houston, there's something tarnished there in the depiction of that. For example, her mother has always struck me as manipulative in how she tells the story of her daughter, and there's a bitterness in how she tells the story, and there's other relatives where it's a similar thing where it doesn't feel totally credible and totally rooted in a place of love. It feels also rooted in a place of control, and let me control the narrative now. Whereas with Robin Crawford, there's something about it that feels more honest to me, and like they were two girls from New Jersey, you know what I mean? Two girls from New Jersey who suddenly were catapulted into this world, and Robin was there to be her ally, but unfortunately, because of the time, because of the nature of their dynamic, eventually there was a separation, and she had to watch this tragedy unfold from a distance. Before making this video much longer, I'm gonna end it. Guys, tell me what you think in the comments. And also, I want to know what your favorite Whitney Houston song is. My favorite Whitney Houston song is from the first album. Underrated song, by the way. It was not like one of her biggest songs, but it is You Give Good Love. I love that song. Tell me what you think in the comments.